A lot of cartoons or creators you see will usually try to have their own styles to differentiate themselves from the crowd. And I don't think it's unfair to say that the style of Bob's Burgers is pretty striking. From Gene's outbursts to Tina's friend fiction to just the designs of the characters, Bob's Burgers presents a very unique take on the animated sitcom. But with just how out there some of the elements of the show are, one very obvious thing seems to always get a pass, but when you think about it, it's kinda weird. What's with Louise's bunny ears? Louise, while arguably the loudest of the Belcher family, though Gene would definitely give her a run for her money, is almost certainly one of the most intelligent. Louise is a schemer, a scoundrel with a strange distaste for Canada. Who hates Canada?
I hate that country.
And while some of her plans are half-baked, sometimes she's downright brilliant. Louise never does anything without some sort of purpose. So if that's the case, why does she insist on wearing her bunny ears all the time? Is there some facet of herself that she's trying to keep hidden? So, Louise's bunny hood, as most who have seen Bob's Burgers are well aware, is a constant presence that is never removed from her head. Like, ever. They're so much a part of Louise's character that they've basically become an extension of herself. So much so that she even wears them when she sleeps and when she dons costumes. Most notably the Halloween episodes where she's dressed up as both Ryan Gosling from Drive and as Edward Scissorhands, or as Sad Wolverine if you're Linda. But the one thing these costumes have in common is that Louise has integrated her bunny ears into both of them. As if Edward Scissorhands' hair wasn't crazy enough already. Stop giving Tim Burton ideas, Louise. Pretty soon we're gonna have like Edward Scissorhands meets Donnie Darko. That sounds awesome. Louise, keep giving these people ideas. They're such a necessary part of life for her that when she's finally separated from them in Earsy Rider, not only does she seem completely erratic emotionally, more than usual, I mean, but she dedicates every waking moment of her life to taking revenge on Logan. Rightly so, because Logan is the worst. I've heard two big theories in the past as to why Louise always wears her bunny ears, and funnily enough, they have a lot in common. So we're gonna touch on the two of those today. The basic premise of these theories is that Louise uses her ears to hide some sort of facet of her outward appearance. And this mystery thing that she's hiding, depending on which theory we're looking at, either have to do directly with Linda or with Bob respectively. The first of these theories states that Louise could be resenting the fact that she's growing up to look like her mother Linda. The family resemblance is already pretty apparent, and it doesn't help that their hair is styled similarly. So the theory goes that she wears the ears to distract people, mainly herself, from this reality. She's still a child and doesn't like to be embarrassed. And since Linda is one of the quintessential TV moms, she has her moments that'll cause kids to wonder, wow, am I actually related to this person? Also, their relationship has been shown to be pretty volatile. For instance, in the episode where Louise's opinions of Linda and Bob were most focused on, Mother-Daughter Laser Razor. That is the best name for an episode to say ever. In the episode, Linda discusses with Bob that Louise has always preferred her father, even as a baby somehow. Also in Carpe Museum, we learned that Louise looks up to Bob quite a bit. Until that was revealed, I wouldn't have imagined Louise looking up to anybody but herself. But seeing just how much Louise seems to prefer Bob, it would make sense for her to live in denial over the fact that she's destined to grow up to look like her mother. Speaking of Louise's link with Bob, there's actually another theory that has to do more with him than with Linda. It posits that she might wear the bunny ears to hide something that she inherited through genes. Genes as in like DNA, not as in like her brother. Gene is alive, okay? The idea for this one is that she covers the top of her head because she, like Bob, has a bald spot. And believe it or not, wearing a bunny hood all the time might actually be one of the least conspicuous ways for a kid to hide that. Imagine if she just shaved her head or tried pulling off a wig. I'm not saying Louise couldn't pull off a hairpiece, but getting fitted for a convincing one would probably involve getting at least one other person involved in her secret, and Louise has a hard time trusting people. Really, a hat's just much easier for her. I mean, it makes sense. How would you feel if you started losing your hair at 9? So here we have two major theories as to why Louise is always wearing her bunny hood. Both of which have to do with some sort of lingering resentment or denial over just how much she's like her parents, which fits her character nicely. Of her, Tina, and Gene, Louise's actions are certainly the farthest from her parents because, you know, Bob and Linda aren't sociopaths. Probably. But other than hiding her outward appearance, is there any other reason why Louise would be so determined to keep those bunny ears glued to her head? First off, let's take a look at our proposed theories, beginning with the Linda theory. The thing to consider on this one is that it's actually debatable whether or not Louise actually dislikes her mother. After all, she is just a kid. Kids tend to rebel against authority because, because. And Louise is no exception. She just has her own extreme ways of rebelling against authority, which of course extends towards her parents. And Louise shows not only signs of self-awareness, but also of actual remorse in mother-daughter laser razor. Louise seems surprised when she realizes her mother thinks she doesn't like her. She even apologizes for going too far with the whole thing. Well, she tries to apologize before being rudely interrupted by Dakota, that is. There's also the fact that we've actually seen Louise as a baby, and even back then she was sporting a pink hat. No rabbit ears, but still something worth taking into account. Seems like Louise's propensity for hats has been more of a constant in her life than we once thought. And unless baby Louise has the power to see into the future, it's a little odd to think that she would continue to grow up wearing this hat under the assumption that she would grow up to look like Linda. When it comes to the bald spot theory, there's actually a lot of evidence in the show that would suggest that this isn't actually the case. Going by the very brief sequence of events in Easy Rider when Louise is without her hat, her body language seems to disagree with the theory. When her ears are shockingly removed, Louise doesn't have much on her to cover her head other than, her hands. And yet, no one mentions a bald spot when Logan tears the ears off. And you'd think Logan at least would have said something. He is, after all, the worst. Even in the one extremely tight shot we see of Louise holding her head immediately after losing her ears, she doesn't seem to be making a conscious effort to cover the top of her head, which is likely where the bald spot would be if it were indeed similar to Bob's. Instead, she's holding the sides of her head in shock. But maybe that's not quite convincing enough. We obviously can't see the top of her head, so who's to say there isn't a bald spot there? Science, that's who. In the episode Broadcast Wagstaff School News, Bob is described as having male pattern baldness. With that in mind, there are two major things to think about here. The first thing being that Louise suffering from male pattern baldness would be a little weird considering she's, female. And when it comes to pattern hair loss, it actually works a bit differently between men and women. Men are known to develop a bald spot in the back of the head, as is apparent with Bob's hairstyle and probably most of your dad's friends. But with women, it's usually a lot more gradual, with baldness not actually happening until after a significant thinning of the hair, if full baldness is ever to happen at all. And Louise's hair still looks pretty thick to me. The other obvious factor is that Louise is still a kid. Pattern hair loss isn't known to be incredibly apparent until around the 30 to 50 age range. It can start earlier, but if it does, it usually starts after puberty, a stage in life that Louise is yet to hit. But all that is going based off the assumption that Louise has some kind of pattern baldness. But what about the causes of hair loss in children? While it's rather rare, it is indeed a thing. According to the American Hair Loss Association, there are multiple causes of hair loss in children, including, but not limited to, ringworm of the scalp or alopecia areata. The problem with these and most other conditions concerning hair loss in children is that there are other side effects that Louise doesn't show. Things like itching or swelling. And if these conditions go untreated, they eventually lead to more dramatic hair loss, which, again, Louise doesn't seem to be having any trouble with. Based on what we've seen here today, it doesn't seem like Louise wears her bunny ears as an attempt to hide herself physically, but because to her, the ears represent something much more than what they actually are. To Louise, they're her comfort object. You may have informally heard of the concept of comfort objects or transitional objects somewhere before, most likely from the comic strip Peanuts, which has the character of Linus who is unable to cope without his security blanket. It popularized the idea so much that the term security blanket has essentially become a synonym for comfort objects as a whole. The very basic psychology is that when a really young kid starts to grow and become more of a separate being from their parents, they'll tend to cling to the past as they learn about the world. As they realize that they need to become more independent, a child will find something to sort of act as a substitute to their parents' affection in their absence. Usually something warm that they can cuddle to ease anxieties. The thing about these comfort objects to keep in mind though is that a lot of them eventually become so important to the kid that they could be considered an extension of themselves. And that object is usually only abandoned when that child is ready. Sound familiar? Many children use things like teddy bears or soft toys or yes, even security blankets pretty commonly. Louise most likely just happened to cling to a certain little pink hat that we've seen before. She's just clung to it for an abnormally long time, and replacing it with other similar head coverings that fit her in later years. Some examples of this behavior can be found in the way that Louise acts during Easy Rider. When separated from her ears, not only is she a tad more on edge, but she doesn't accept any substitutes either. Her family even encourages her to try another hat because You know, baby steps. But she's not having any of that. She needs those specific ears back. And this is because she's just grown so attached to them over the years, ever since she was a baby. They represent too much to her. To Louise, those ears are her childhood. And losing her childhood would probably cause Louise to be a little bit more unhinged than we're used to. Now today we've pretty extensively covered the question of why does Louise wear bunny ears, but one thing we haven't really focused on is why does Louise wear bunny ears? And unfortunately, there isn't a whole lot of concrete evidence in the show that would demonstrate why Louise grew so attached to a bunny hood rather than some other kind of hat. But before we leave today, I'd like to give you some insights as to why this might be the case, at least from the production side of things. And the first things we can look at are the potential theories of why her character was designed this way. First off, we have the movie Gummo, an art film made in 1997. There's a lot to unpack with that movie, so for our purposes, we're just going to say that in the movie there is a boy that constantly wears a pink bunny hood. That's pretty on the nose if this were inspiration for Louise. But at the same time, this movie seems like a bit of a twisted place to draw inspiration from for a show like Bob's Burgers. And yes, I'm saying that fully aware that the Belchers were originally planned to be cannibals. This movie is a lot. One pretty common theory is that she wears the bunny ears as a homage to Marge Simpson, who was originally planned to have actual rabbit ears hiding under her massive tower of hair. This was meant to be a sort of inside joke that mirrored Matt Groening's previous work Life in Hell, which featured characters that were rabbits. There's even proof of this original plan in the Simpsons arcade game before the idea was scrapped. The rationale of this theory is that Bob's Burgers pays homage to their predecessor, and also contemporary, by presenting these bunny ears to the audience in plain view at all times. But in this regard, we actually have been given some information as to where the idea for Louise's bunny ears came from. In a 2013 interview with the AV Club, showrunner Lauren Bouchard said the following when asked about the inspiration for Louise's character design. Right from the get-go, we knew we wanted to do that with her. Partly inspired by this anime called Tekken Kinkrit. Side note, apologies for pronunciation. There was this kid who had this little bear hat, and I liked that weird combination of kid and animal, where they became an animal by always being seen wearing these little ears. You get a little cognitive dissonance when you experience Louise both as a little girl and Bugs Bunny at the same time. It makes sense to me that they'd want the audience to associate a plotter and a schemer like Louise with one of the most cunning animated characters of all time. Give her a few years and Louise might not be much further down the list after all. It's nice to have creator feedback regarding the design, but unfortunately it still leaves half of our question unanswered. But this opens the door to even more theories. It could be something as simple as Bob and Linda giving her some when she was very young, leading to an attachment. But maybe it could be something else. For example, maybe she grew attached to them specifically because to her they match her larger than life personality. Without them, she's undoubtedly the smallest member of the Belcher family, but with them, she's actually a little taller than Jean. And since the ears at this point are considered an extension of herself, she could use that added height to lord over Jean because you know she would do that. You know she would. Louise definitely wears her bunny ears to shield herself from the outside world in her own way, but it certainly doesn't seem like she's wearing them to hide some sort of inherited trait from her parents, because here's the thing. A lot of comparisons have been thrown around lately that Bob's Burgers is to today what The Simpsons was to 20 years ago. And those comparisons are actually pretty on the mark. Not only does it capture the attitudes of its time in a lovingly unique way, but it also possesses a similar central theme. Bob's Burgers is at its core a show about the Belcher family and the unconditional love they have for each other, despite the warts and cracks of the family not only being visible but actively paraded throughout most of the show. To grossly oversimplify everyone, Bob's too pragmatic for his own good, Linda and Jean are obnoxious, Tina's adolescence has been nothing short of a dumpster fire, and Louise, where do you even start? Bob even acknowledges this in the first episode of the series. Listen, you're my children and I love you, but you're all terrible at what you do here. And I feel like I should tell you, I'd fire you all if I could. But Bob even says it. He loves them unconditionally. They're his family. And while it isn't concrete evidence, it seems weird to me if one of the biggest mysteries of the show had to do with Louise being ashamed of her parents or her family. But who knows, maybe they'll address it sometime later in the series. Heck, if they really are this generation Simpsons, we have another 22 years to find out. At least. All in all, I'm giving the Louise wears her bunny ears to hide her appearance conspiracy 2 credit cards cut up like ninja stars out of 5. But what do you think? Do you think Louise could be wearing her bunny ears for some other reason? Also, who of the Belcher family do you feel you most relate to? As much as I weirdly wished I was like Louise, I'm probably more of a Bob myself. Or Teddy. Does Teddy count? No, Teddy doesn't count. Nah, Teddy doesn't count. No. He doesn't. He doesn't. He doesn't. Teddy doesn't count. Be sure to let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Also drop a comment if you have any conspiracies you'd like us to take a look at in the future. Lastly, be sure to like this video and subscribe to channel Frederator for more cartoon conspiracies.